All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ore Kolade, and I'm the technical manager for this session on animal source foods, chaired by Emon Udom-Kesmeli. Thank you for taking part in the ANH Academy Week, and we look forward to a robust and interactive session today. A quick reminder that everything that you need to access the conference materials and program can be found on the ANH Academy website. Now, I'm sure you've heard this if you've been part of our sessions in the last few days, but it's worth repeating for those who haven't. So before Imon takes the conversation forward, I have a few technical announcements to make to ensure that our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. First, we get this question all the time, but the session will be recorded and posted on the ANH Academy website sometime next week. Second, you'll notice that you're all being muted, but please introduce yourselves using the chat function. Tell us your name, where you're joining from, and the organization you work with. You can access the chat box by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We encourage you to share your webcam video feed during this session if you don't have bandwidth issues. If you prefer not to, you can put on a profile picture if you are logged into your own Zoom account. If your connection gets patchy, we do recommend turning off your video. Later in the session, we will open up the conversation with a Q&A session. If you have questions, please share them in the chat box throughout the session, and we'll do our best to answer them during the Q&A session. If we have time, we'll also ask you to raise your hands so that you can speak your question aloud. Lastly, if at any point you experience technical issues, please check your audio settings and your internet connection. You can always try to reconnect to the session using the same Zoom link. And if you have a technical question, please send me a private message using the chat box. All right, have a great session, and over to you, Imon.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that introduction. And greetings, everyone. Welcome to the session on animal source foods. For those of you who probably have seen the Eat Lancet Commission early on this year, there's a lot of discussion about the role of animal source foods, and particularly when the reference diet called for a reduction of consumption of meat to save the planet. I want to say that in many countries of the world, developing countries, low middle income countries, animal source foods are the most important one in order to build and fill the nutrient gaps, build up health for vulnerable groups, strengthen the livelihoods, its economic, they have social aspect, and all the things that deserve to be looked at. So we are having in part this presentation that shows you, particularly coming from Africa, of how important this is, and as part of a food value chain and the food system that I'm sure you have seen the abstract or the presentation. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our 5 presenters, and we have Caroline Hamblock from ICRISAT. She'll be the first presenter, then followed by Kendra Beard from WorldFish. Then we have Aurelia Le Pen from University College London, and Robin Elders from the Chatham House in London, and also last one, Sol Purwas from SOAS, University of London. So I would like to then start off with Caroline, who's going to talk to us about the highlights from the presentation on assessing the institutional environment for inclusive livestock value chains in Malawi. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I hope we can all see the presentation. So I will present to you some initial findings of our EU-funded research in southern Malawi, which assesses the institutional environment for inclusive livestock value chains. So this research is motivated by the great potential of animal-sourced foods to tackle development challenges in land-scarce environments such as Malawi, especially with respect to poverty reduction, improving nutrition outcomes, and reducing food insecurity. The focus in this project is on dairy, poultry, and goat value chains. The government of Malawi has recognized the high potential of the dairy sector, yet poultry and goats, despite its significant contributions to livelihoods and food security, are only attributed minor significance. The key research question we ask in this component of the project is, to what extent do public policies and practices enable or hinder the sustainable development of smallholder-based livestock value chains? We follow a two-step approach by first mapping and analyzing the three value chains from a policy perspective, and then second by conducting a policy analysis. From this, then we derive policy recommendations. The analysis rests on various research methods, such as interviews, innovation platforms, and policy dialogues, some of which unfortunately have been impacted by COVID-19. Currently, the data collection is still ongoing because we had some delay. I will highlight three main results in this short presentation. First, we find that policies and regulations are generally not conducted in consultation with its stakeholders and hence do not address their concerns, most notably smallholders. This is mainly due to the fact that there is very little horizontal governance at the point of production, resulting in limited influence of smallholders in the policy process. Concerns about low prices and the unavailability of alternative marketing channels have been raised in all three value chains. Second, public expenditures going to the livestock sector are far behind crops such as maize and tobacco, demonstrated, for instance, by fewer extension officers available to livestock farmers compared to crop farmers. Most strikingly is the fact that between 2006 and 2013, only 1.2% of agriculture-specific public expenditures are allocated to livestock compared to 71% for maize. Third, there are large policy implementation gaps, as policies are usually designed at the national level with little to no consultation with lower level government, while implementation takes place at the district levels. This results in issues of ownership and contrasting priorities. I will highlight three policy implications. First, it is clear that the livestock sector should be a key priority for agricultural development and nutrition, particularly in land-scarce environments such as Malawi. Policy support is necessary to increase productivity, especially decreasing animal mortalities, reduce the cost of animal feeds, and improve access and affordability of animal-sourced foods. Second, value chain actors, particularly smallholder producers, need to be involved in the policy process, requiring the organization of value chain actors into interest groups. And third, there's a need to design and implement policies which focus on developing alternative marketing channels for small producers, especially local value addition, for which infrastructure, quality control, and price premiums are important. Further research is needed to examine to what extent increasing incomes and increased food access from on production are able to contribute to improved nutrition, as livestock remains an emergency asset. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. So let me then go to the second presenter, Kendra Beard, and she's going to talk to us about the contribution of inland fisheries to diet and growth of children in sub-Saharan Africa, a food systems approach. Kendra, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone for coming to this panel. Let me just share my screen. 1 second. Okay, can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay. How about now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I will be discussing an analysis that I did as part of a report called the Eliminating Hidden Harvest Project in collaboration with FAO and Duke University. And I did this analysis in collaboration with Lydia O'Mara, who's also in the call today. And it is titled The Contribution of Inland Fisheries to the Diets of Children in Sub-Saharan Africa, a Food Systems Approach. And specifically, our analysis was in Malawi and Zambia. And we wanted to ask the question, does living closer to inland fisheries lead to increased fish consumption in children? And we wanted to focus on inland fisheries because they are often ignored in the fisheries or downplayed in the fisheries discussions where marine fisheries dominate the discussion. So while we do know that inland fisheries provides an important source of food and livelihood to households, we wanted to more closely examine the link between inland fisheries and the diets of children, specifically between 6 and 24 months, covering that critical period of the first 1,000 days. So we asked, does living closer to inland fisheries lead to increased fish consumption in children? And is this fish consumption associated with improved dietary diversity? And how do inland fisheries compare with other potential sources of animal source foods, for example, access to the formal market or livestock ownership? And so we were able, I will just highlight a few conclusions, which also highlight our innovative methods whereby we used secondary data sets, such as the DHS, the Demographic and Health Surveys, which are nationally representative data sets for both Malawi and Zambia. And we were able to link them with geographical data sets, such as the Global Lakes and Rivers database, to actually look at the distance of the households from the inland fisheries. And we also, using the DHS data, disentangled aquatic animal source food consumption from terrestrial animal source food consumption, considering that those might have different factors that influence those foods in the diets. So we found that if children lived closer to inland fisheries, they were more likely to eat fish and exhibit higher dietary diversity. We also looked at wealth based on the asset score, and we found that in wealthier households, children were more likely to eat animal source foods of all types, and in Malawi exhibit a higher dietary diversity. And in considering the formal market, if they were closer to a formal market, they were more likely to eat terrestrial animal source foods such as eggs and chicken, but not fish. And in households that owned livestock, children did not eat more terrestrial animal source foods. So this was not associated with consumption in our analysis. And lastly, inland fisheries, we found that they're an important source of wealth for households in Malawi, but not in Zambia. Proximity to inland fisheries was associated with wealth in Malawi only. And so the implications for this are that this provides an important finding that the inland fisheries are an important source of fish and subsequent dietary quality for children under 2 in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically Malawi and Zambia. And we wanted to highlight it's important to safeguard these natural resources to ensure an ongoing source of nutrient-rich foods for these children. And for example, fisheries governance needs to effectively balance conservation goals with livelihood and food security needs, given the importance of this animal source food. And in order for livestock to enhance the dietary quality of children under 2, interventions need to possibly consider behavior change communication, or maybe some of the things that Caroline was talking about in her presentation. And so this work is part of the Illuminating Hidden Harvest project, which is a large global project on small-scale fisheries, which will come out in early 2021. So you can look for a bigger report on small-scale fisheries and inland fisheries if you're interested. And so I wanted to thank FAO and Duke University for supporting this work, and also my colleagues at World Fish.
Thank you very much, Kendra. So let's go to the next presenter. I want to also remind that those who want to do a Q&A, please use the chat box, and then say who you want to, the question that you would like to address to. Okay, Aurelia Lepen is our next presenter on the study of the demand drivers of animal source food consumption in Nairobi's lower income households.
Yes, hello everyone. So we have a short video that I wanted to show you in order to present a bit more the context and the objective and the methods we used in this study. However, my connection is quite unstable. So I don't know, Ray, if you have access to the link, or do you want me to share the screen?
I'll try to share it now. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, I'll start playing.
source foods such as meat, fish, eggs, and milk are highly nutritious foods and are important for children's healthy development. These foods are all high in essential micronutrients such as vitamin B12, iron, and zinc. It is easier for the body to absorb these nutrients from animal source foods than from other food groups. Even small portions of animal source foods during the day can make a huge difference in the contribution to a person's micronutrient requirements. We designed a study to understand how vulnerable households in Nairobi make decisions about whether and which of these foods to consume. We focused on the different factors that influence the consumption of animal source foods, as this food group is generally underrepresented in the diets of the poor. We conducted household surveys and focus group discussions, along with an economic game to uncover which factors, for example, cost, preference, perceived nutritional value, or the mother's decision-making power within the family are most important to food purchase decisions. The poorest households are, of course, limited by economic constraints when deciding whether and which animal source foods to purchase. However, other considerations such as food safety also come into play. Animal source foods are indeed the food group to which most foodborne disease can be traced. Foodborne disease is a major concern in developing countries and disproportionately affects children and pregnant women. Animal source foods are critical to nutrition, but consumption of these foods by people living in informal settlements around Nairobi and by low-income populations globally is too low. There is a need to provide these populations with better access to animal source foods and nutritional information that can inform their choices. In order to improve nutritional status, especially for children under the age of 5, whose nutrition today will have lifelong consequences. Ultimately, through this study, we hope to contribute to improving sustainable food systems to promote better nutrition.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So for the next presenter, we will hear Robin Alders, who's going to give us the presentation from the smallholder livestock and aquaculture policy environment. What's required to achieve economic, environmental, and social sustainability? Robin, the floor is yours, please. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emon. Thank you so much. I'm getting a signal that my internet is unstable here in rural Australia. Do let me know if you can't hear me clearly. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you, and I want to acknowledge my colleagues and also to acknowledge all the other co-authors. This is a project that ran over 18 months, and it was working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Livestock Initiative and with the animal systems component of that work. Their work focuses on improving income, productivity, nutrition, and addressing issues of gender balance within livestock and aquaculture. And this particular project was exploring smallholder livestock and aqua public expenditure in this area. We, in addition to reviewing policy issues on a wider sense, we worked with two case study countries, and they were Bangladesh and Nigeria. And so what I'm going to do is share with you some of the key findings, and we've already heard some of this today in our session. And one of the key findings was simply a lack of political support for food and agriculture. There's been very low, totally inadequate public investment at national, regional and global levels. And this is really across all countries. There are very few countries where agriculture is getting significant attention, and in particular livestock and animal health, animal welfare is often quite poorly funded. Aquaculture is growing very quickly. It's a very large industry, but it's not necessarily seeing balanced levels of support, particularly where small-scale producers are involved. One of the major problems we face is that efforts are quite fragmented. So projects may focus on improving production, they may focus on improving market, trying to join up all of the key activities that will help smallholders to deliver sustainable projects in the long term. So looking at investments across soil, plants, water and animal health, and that's for both terrestrial and aquatic animal health. This is really a crucial issue, particularly as we think about the fact that many smallholders are already facing the challenge of climate impacting on their production. The need to mitigate and to adapt to climate change is essential, but there are also roles that producers can play in helping with carbon sequestration, improving water and soil retention, and contributing to sustainable and resilient food systems. One thing that was clear in both of our case study countries when we talked to senior decision makers in national roundtables was that there was a lack of data and a lack of data robustness. In each country, there was agreement on a list of key indicators that decision makers felt that they needed. And in both countries, approximately 50% of the indicators, they felt that they did not have the data that they needed to help them make informed decisions. We have, as I mentioned before, there tends to be a focus on more short-term economic outcomes. It's clear that producers do need to make a better income, but it needs to be linked to longer-term projects that will help them to engage in production practices that are going to be sustainable, both economically, socially, and environmentally. And one of the key issues is a lack of inclusive governments. In most cases, there was not a lack of policies. Policies were there, but often they were not known. Policies were not widely recognised, even within government settings and certainly by smallholders. And often there was simply a lack of investment and funding to be able to implement policies as designed. And this was feedback from both the public and private sectors. We want to thank very much our collaborators in the government of Bangladesh and Nigeria, and to everyone who is involved in the project. If you'd like to follow up with us, do please send us an email. And the take-home message is that inclusive government is vital to policy implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin. So we'll go to the last presenter, Sol Pervas. She's going to talk about supporting small farmers in highly industrialized broiler value chains to promote rural livelihoods and nutrition security, a system dynamics approach. Sol, please.
Thank you, Iman. I'm going to share my screen as well. that okay? Great. So yes, hello everyone. Our research, I'm happy to present our research on supporting smallholders and highly industrialized broiler value chains. This is research in collaboration with colleagues from SOAS and from RBC and UK Seren in South Africa. So the context of our research is the South African broiler value chain, and we focus on the challenges that smallholders experience, the policies that address those challenges, and the potential impacts that these can have on outcomes that we're interested in. So smallholders in the broiler value chain, which is highly industrialized, are important from the point of view of rural livelihoods, but even though they produce quite a small proportion of the overall output, they can also support nutrition security because they, particularly for populations in rural areas and townships, because these populations often don't have such good access to, sorry, this keeps skipping, such good access to supermarkets or refrigeration or reliable electricity. So they can buy live chickens from small producers that are close to them geographically. So in this research, we have used a qualitative system dynamics approach based on stakeholder interviews and document analysis. We have formulated a series of partial causal loop diagrams, which reflect key patterns and mechanisms in the value chain, and we have integrated them into a full diagram to help us unpack our data. So this is one of the partial causal loop diagrams, and this is the full diagram where you can see, I'm aware there's no time for you to really take all of this in, but just so you can see what it looks like. You can see the policy entry points in red, and the flows of funds are the red arrows. And just to unpack this diagram a bit, we identify 5 barriers that have to do with access to inputs, market, credit and training, and policy entry points related to infrastructure grants, credits, market aggregation mechanisms, training and input access as well. And then there are 4 of these causal loop diagrams which explore the links between these different elements. So in terms of the conclusions and insights at a bit more of a systems level, we find that the different challenges that smallholders face are mutually reinforcing in many ways, and they're linked across them, and that there's this key policy entry points that are strongly complementary in the sense that success in some areas can be undermined by lack of action in other areas. So all of this highlights very strongly the need for integrated policy approaches. And again, this, I don't want to go over time, but this echoes a lot of what Robin Alders was talking about, in the sense that there are policies targeting these different elements, but they are not often not fully implemented. And when there are insufficient funds, sometimes aspects of these interventions are not carried out, and then that undermines the overall efficiency. So you can't really choose if you want to support smallholders. There are a series of basic interventions that need to be in place, I would say. And these are just some points for further research. To conclude, we could follow up, because this is all qualitative, with parameterization and some quantitative scenario simulation, evaluation of specific interventions, or the political economy of policy integration. Why does this policy integration not happen? Thank you very much. And yeah, I would also like to thank my co-authors and our participants as well.
Thank you very much indeed for all this very interesting presentation. And I really see that there has been many of the questions that is being addressed, particularly well, already gonna have to help me. I'm trying to move the boxes. Yeah. Okay. So
Can you see it now?
To try and load. Yes. It's now here. So we have already many of the questions that comes for Kendra. Kendra, you're going to have to, we'll have to start with you. The first question is, how did you define proximity to inland fisheries, and are the natural fisheries in natural lakes or man-made tanks?
Okay, I'll answer the second one first. These are natural lakes and rivers and water bodies that were in the database. They're not aquaculture tanks. These are all fisheries. That said, some of them could be man-made reservoirs, but not tanks, no aquaculture. Secondly, we defined proximity to fisheries as a continuous variable. So we took the distance from the household cluster where the data were collected and measured the distance to the nearest water body in meters. And then we did look at it categorically, I believe between 5 meters and under, 5 to 50 meters and over 50 meters to look at it as that way. But in our models, we ran it as a continuous variable, the distance to the inland fisheries in meters.
Okay. The next question is, for what reason is it important to study inland fisheries separately from marine fisheries? What are the important differences?
Yeah, there are some key differences in species, and that will influence nutrient availability. And inland fisheries often support small-scale fishers, whereas marine fisheries support a lot more large-scale fisheries, so a lot of industrial fishing. Not to say there aren't small-scale fisheries and marine fisheries, but both are important resources. But I was just trying to highlight that inland fisheries is sometimes a little bit swept under the rug, especially in the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 14, life underwater, specifically talks about marine fisheries, and sometimes inland gets, like I said, a little bit ignored, but we wanted to highlight the role that inland fisheries play in nutrition, again, specifically for 6 to 24-month-olds.
What is the possible explanation of households that own livestock consuming less animal source foods, and why do households closer to formal markets consume less terrestrial animal source food than fish?
Right. So
we're interested in this one.
Yeah, it was an interesting finding, though perhaps when you think about it, not completely unexpected. And I just want to make clear that households that own livestock didn't consume less fish than households that didn't own livestock. We just didn't find an association between livestock ownership and animal source food consumption. And we think that's largely because of the nature of livestock foods, right? If you think about a cow or a goat in rural settings, those are not killed very often, maybe only for a special occasion. So it wouldn't be influencing the diet of a young child. It was a little more confusing if you think about milk or eggs and why cow ownership or chicken ownership wouldn't necessarily be associated with those foods in a child's diet. But perhaps it has to do with inter-household allocation or the use of own production foods for consumption versus sale. But yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be investigated further. But our conclusion was, since this was national data, this wasn't an intervention, that if livestock intervention, or that if a livestock intervention is going to be conducted in a community, it probably needs to be paired with a social behavior change communication program.
Okay, I'm going to give you a break, Kendra, and I'll come back to you later. Let's go to Aurelia. Aurelia, there's a question. Did you measure any social or cultural factors related to decision-making about animal source food purchases in Nairobi?
Yes, thank you. So yes, one thing that we did in this study is that we developed a new measure of women's empowerment. And of course, because it's a new measure, we also collected a lot of information on the determinants of women's bargaining power in the literature to try to prove that we were indeed measuring women's empowerment with our new measure. So, so we collect data on the trust between the spouses. We also have information on domestic violence. So we measure it actually with a list experiment in order to overcome the social desirability bias. And we also collect a lot of economic information on who is contributing to the household resources, if it's more the women or the husband. So yeah, so we do have all this information in the quantitative survey. And actually we find there are important drivers of women's empowerment of the measure we have developed. And then what we did is that we complement that in order to understand a bit more why women have such low decision making in this context. We also did a lot of focus group and in-depth interviews. So this was led not by myself, but by my anthropologist colleagues. And indeed, they really study more the cultural aspect. So I think they have a poster, part of this conference, where they present their qualitative results.
Okay, I think there's my screen is going a bit berserk here, but I think there's another question for you, so you might want to have that. Did you consider the availability or not of a cold chain when looking at the health aspects of meat consumption by the participant families?
Yeah, so what we did, so we have a household survey, and then we asked to every household to state who are the main beef retailers in their area. And what we did is that we went to those beef retailers, and we had this information on whether they had a fridge, about like where they were storing animal source foods. So what we find actually is that this did not impact like all the quality measures of animal source food, had no impact on purchase and consumption of animal source foods. So yeah, so we have this information at the retailer level, but it had no effect on the purchase of animal source food.
Okay, so I'm just gonna move. Thank you very much to Caroline. There's a question on lack of stakeholder inclusion in policy process and limitation of public resource to livestock are really relevant constraints. At the FIF Innovation Lab for Livestock System, we're trying to move the needle through policy roundtables and workshops that open dialogue on these issues in countries. Have you tried any activity or policy communication message that you think may be impactful in Malawi?
Yeah, thank you very much. So regarding the disconnect between policy design and especially implementation, I think that also came out in a lot of this discussion, that implementation really is a big gap here. One of the things that relates to Malawi is that the design of policies usually happens at the national level, and those that implement, those are administrators at the district level, are usually not included in the design of the policy process. But then in addition, also these policies that are being designed are generally not done in consultation with the stakeholders that are affected by these. So these are smallholders, but these also processors. So also for instance, the big dairy processors in Malawi, these are 5 processors, are also generally not included in any of the policy discussions, and usually pushback has been done through lobbying efforts as a sort of reactive way to go against policies proposed by the government. But the design of these policies is generally not done in consultation with these actors. And quality control is really a key issue in the livestock sector in Malawi. And is very important in order for especially smallholders to diversify marketing channels. So this is particularly relevant, for instance, for the dairy industry and for smallholders to be able to sell to other retailers and processors other than these big 5. And then another point that relates to that, to this disconnect, is obviously the insufficient funding. This has also been mentioned by others. So the insufficient funding that's available from the public sectors to implement these policies. And in the case of Malawi, that's relevant to the Malawi Bureau of Standards. So that's a regulatory authority to check the quality. And there's generally not enough funds to do quality checks at the point of production. So usually quality checks are done downstream. So for instance, with processors and retailers, but then quality checks further upstream, so with producers, has then to be implemented by the processors themselves. So the Malawi Bureau of Standards would not go out and check at the production level. And as I said, that relates to also a lot of funding being diverted to maize rather than the livestock sector. And then in relation to the last question, with the policy roundtable, so we plan to do policy dialogues, so successive rounds of policy dialogues with all relevant stakeholders, but due to COVID-19, we had to now postpone this. But the intent was to co-design policy recommendations to sort of generate more buy-in also by policymakers to generate change. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to do this as of yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Robin, I lost the screen. Can you give some examples of what some more integrated activities and investment would look like, and what would be good example of inclusive governance? Also, what are the most important data gaps to be filled?
Thanks so much for that, and thanks to Stella, Francis, and Tommy for these great questions. There are very few examples of joined up approaches, and I think it is very complex. And in our modern world, where it's very difficult to get international donors to commit to long-term investments, I think it has to be led by national governments who have a vision and who want to see the work implemented, and possibly with support from philanthropic organizations, those that are going to be less impacted by political changes that can influence the international donors. If you're going to work with people, with soil, with plants, with animals, with water, it takes time to get all of those different groups together, and then to monitor and to see change over time. These are 5 to 10 year commitments. So it's a new way, and not necessarily new, but it's certainly not how things are frequently done at the moment, and I think really needs national guidance to steer investment and to bring investment in to get those sorts of programs in place. In terms of gaps in data, very simple things, that a lot of data is based because it's been collected through a project. So it may not, decision makers may not have data across their country that's relevant to local areas. So some examples are things like, what's the distance to market for your smallholder? How is climate change impacting people? And very simply, what's the average income for a female smallholder farmer versus a male smallholder farmer? Very simple data, but in most cases, people didn't have ready access to that information. In terms of inclusive governance, well, that's a tough one. Globally, very hard to give good examples in that case. I believe that the Bangladeshi government does quite a good job. Their 5-year program that they're currently implementing to deliver nutrition sensitive food systems is an excellent example of a multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral approach to a complex problem. And our colleagues in Bangladesh are working right now to set up a policy forum. At this stage has a focus on poultry, but bringing in all the different stakeholders so that they are able to have an input into not only how policies are designed, but how current policies are actually implemented, to increase knowledge of those policies and then to inform possible changes to that. In terms of how did we measure political support, indications from the roundtable, from people themselves, but one of the key indicators was simply looking at if you measure the percentage of livestock or aquaculture's contribution to GDP, and then you look at the proportion of the recurrent budget that is allocated to each of those. In most cases, you find that percentage allocated is well under what the percentage contribution to GDP is. So that suggests a lack or a disconnect from those who make the decisions. I hope that's answered your questions. If not, send me an email or another question via the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to go to Seoul. Any idea of the cost-benefit rate of the production activities you looked at as an issue to be considered in the proposed policies?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting in the sense that I think to an extent something like cost-benefit analysis or evaluation of a specific policy would be a next step forward from this study, because a qualitative system dynamics analysis is about understanding the system, but you can't really evaluate a policy in terms or in a specific policy design. But that said, and this is the reason why I like this term entry points, because in a sense it's not about so much about the specific policy design, but about this is an issue in the system that needs to be addressed. In that sense, the kind of insight that we got with respect to effectiveness and cost effectiveness of different policies, although we can't make sort of a definite assessment in this sense, but we could have tried to sort of compare different policies in terms of cost effectiveness or rank them. But what came across most strongly from interviews and so on was how strongly complementary this the most important policies were, and how the most frequent type of insight was maybe, yes, we have access this part of the policy, but nothing really works because we haven't accessed this other part, for example, credit for inputs, or because we can't access the market. So what if we have a subsidy for infrastructure? So in that sense, that's why I think cost effectiveness is very important, but that's a second, sort of a further step. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you, Sol. Kendra, I'm going to combine questions into one because it sounds to link. What if you want to promote fish and other livestock for children under 2? You consider sustainability implication as well as for the fish. Is there a safety risk related to inland fisheries and consumption of fish? So,
yeah. I think there are some concerns with the fish drying, for example. Like fish from inland fisheries are often dried, either salted, which leads to a lot of salt in the fish, or even aflatoxin. But there was a recent study that I reviewed that hasn't been published that showed that the aflatoxin in the dried fish was within a safe amount. However, since it is a food that is stored, it has the potential to grow aflatoxin and potentially other bacteria that could be harmful. So yes, so with any food supply, there are food safety concerns that should be taken into account, especially as it's a food from a natural resource, and if there's environmental contamination, that should be addressed. But I don't see it as a concern specific to fish from inland fisheries. And for the second part of the question, I'd like to turn over to Lydia, my colleague who helped me with this analysis, she's the lead author on this analysis. So when the paper comes out, you'll be looking for her name as the first author. And I think she has some insights to share as well.
Is she in the room? Or how?
I'm asking to unmute.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yeah, so the second part of the question was in regards to sustainability. And this is an interesting question because there is fish of different sizes in the inland lakes and rivers. So for instance, if we take Lake Malawi as an example, we do know they have larger fish that were introduced and like the perch, for instance, and they do have sustainability concerns. But we also know that small pelagic fish are actually they're indigenous to these lakes, and they're actually incredibly nutrient dense. And these are the fish that are the ones that are commonly considered low value. So they're actually often kept for home consumption, and the ones that are often kept dried and fed to the small children. So when we're promoting, for instance, fish for children, we are often referring to these small pelagic indigenous fish that are actually indigenous to these areas and quite sustainable long term.
Yeah.
So
and there is,
I don't know if you had more to add to that, Kendra.
I was just going to say, and there is some evidence that the small pelagic fish from inland fisheries are in fact underfished, and that they could have the potential to be more productive. The problem is we're lacking catch data from a lot of countries, and that's what this Illuminating Hidden Harvest project is trying to illuminate, is the better catch data from not just inland fisheries, but small scale fisheries in general. So you have a better idea of how much of these fish are being caught.
Thank you. I know we are running into close to where we have to leave this session, but I have, I think this is an important thing, that we have questions that apply to all of you. There are two of them. So what I would like to invite you, the panelists, to do is select one that you think you can answer. One of the questions that apply to all of you has to do with the importance of policy change. If panelists could advise policymakers in their research context to make one change to support the production and use of animal source foods, either for livelihoods or for home consumption, what would it be? And the other one has to do with, what do we need to do as researchers in this field? What are our responsibilities going forward in terms of elucidating pathways between animal source food and income, and or food security and nutrition, and communicating with other researchers and decision makers? Okay, so let me start with Caroline. Which question you would like to address?
They're both great questions, but I'll go with the second one, which I think relates to sort of the impact pathways that are underlying all these projects. And I think what we need to do is really examine the trade-offs that are inherent with all these different interventions. So these relate to income, nutrition, food security, all sorts of trade-offs within the agri-food system that result of these interventions. So for instance, when we talk about interventions in the poultry sector, it doesn't have to be industrial poultry production, but it could also be indigenous chicken support. And what are the trade-offs when it comes to income nutrition? So in our project, we've actually been looking at local chicken, because we believe that the nutrition implications of supporting the indigenous chicken value chain are higher than in an industrial poultry value chain, where most of the products are actually sold off. So you have an income effect. But what about the nutrition impact? So I think making explicit these trade-offs and then potentially, obviously, collecting data on these different impacts will give us, and very context specific, will give us information on what kind of decisions households make and what kind of impact pathways are relevant for which contexts.
Thank you. So, Kendra?
Yes, so I think sorry?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think, yeah, I'll try to answer the first one on what I would like to see from policymakers, aside from from recognizing inland fisheries as an important animal source food, but maybe more active governments getting small fish into or fish from inland fisheries into complementary foods, promoting it with complementary foods, promoting fish among pregnant women, and potentially school meals, as school meals are often, we're often looking to make them more nutritious and using locally available foods and inland fisheries, given that the nutrient value of the small pelagics and the productivity of the small pelagics, I think it's an untapped resource in some settings, of course not all, that could really be used to improve dietary quality, especially among young children and school children.
Aurelia?
Yes, so in our case, in the context of Kenya, we do find that one of the main determinants of animal source food consumption is the price, because people are very poor. And so there are policies, also policies that will aim to reduce the price or to help people to kind of support the financial cost of animal source food will be effective in increasing consumption. We also find a large impact of women's empowerment. So of course, this is much complicated to change because there are cultural norms that are linked with low women's empowerment and low women's decision making. I also would like to answer very briefly the second question, because we have measure of nutrition in our study. We measure anemia level in children and women, and we do find that children who consume lower animal source food are more have lower nutritional status. So we do find this link between animal source food consumption and nutrition. Thank you.
Thank you. Robin, please.
Thank you. There are two good questions. I think I will go with, if I've understood the second question, it is about animal source food and discussing how it's handled within research. And I think that this is a global problem for me. I have an impression, and I should confess that I'm a veterinarian by training. And so we learn about nutrition and nutrition physiology in different categories of animals. And I simply have the impression that when I talk with some public health nutritionists, is that they don't actually have a background in nutrition physiology. I think they don't necessarily understand how the human physiology works and what it means to be an omnivore. And if we want to have sustainable diets and healthy people, having a component, a small component, 15–20% of our diet as animal source food, is generally much more efficient in terms of carrying capacity, meaning that the resources available at the global and at the country level to support people, everything gets easier and the outcomes are better if there is a component of animal source food. So I think going back to basic education, to helping people to understand the different physiologies, and particularly for the human female. We have unique characteristics. There are very few animals that actually menstruate, and this puts unique pressures on the human female. And I think it would be nice to have it discussed more frequently. Thank you.
Thank you. Sol?
Hi. Yeah, I'll go, I think, for the first question quickly. I wouldn't necessarily dare to recommend one policy, but I do think that the policymakers that we discussed with and that we interviewed had all sorts of different visions and proposals. And what came out very strongly and was very interesting was that some of them did have a vision for what they thought the sector should look like. And in particular, some who have worked with smallholders directly, and they had thought of policies that were not necessarily incredibly interventionist or incredibly expensive, but that could shift the whole sector in a different direction. And for example, one of them talked about how he thought they should have a parallel state franchise, so that the integrators are franchised the most common chick breeds, and there aren't really incentives for other commercial breeds to be available. So he thought that maybe more adapted breeds, but that they're also productive, could be, the franchise could be purchased by the state and they could directly deal with the smallholders. So it's more that kind of attempt to really think about at the system level and which interventions can change the whole system in a more sustainable direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate all these insights, and I would like to say just very quickly that I think that there's a ground to be said, a case to be made for animal source foods to have a role to play, particularly as a game changer for nutrition, for health, for development of economic, social, and livelihoods. And I think there's also a cultural aspect to put into it as well. So the integrated policy that has been talked about, the coordinated way and systematic thinking, particularly along the value chain, are quite important. Data and evidence to show where you need to intervene, with what, and how do you measure the success seems to be, to me, key to where you might want to take a look at. There's a lot more work to do, but I think these 5 presentations provide excellent examples of where already efforts being made. And I would like to encourage those who are in the room and those who are interested to please join, add on to this strength of evidence and all what we can do to be able to reach the policy. I totally agree, we have to make them understand physiology and nutrition in a more simple way. We have not been doing well with that, but I do have hope. And I think that this is the floor that we will make it happen. Let me thank all the 5 presenters, also the audience, all of you that participate. I'm sorry that not all questions can be asked at this time, but please contact the presenter directly through their email so that they can be in touch and respond to your inquiry. Thank you for Ore and the team that helps to manage this session. They are wonderful, and I'm learning so much. This is my first, let's say, virtual conference chair to do this, and they have been, I think, one of the best teams I have ever seen. So thank you so much. Ore, would you like to say something?
All right, thank you very much, Emon, and thank you to our presenters and to everyone who's participated in today's session. I think it's been a really rich session, and like Emon has said, please feel free to contact the presenters, watch their videos as well, because I think it's hard to summarize all they've done in the 3 minutes. Just a couple of announcements. When we leave here, we're going straight into the closing ceremony, and so that straight away you'll find the link on the website. And straight afterwards, we're going into, the party mode. For those of us who come to the live conference, this is how we do it. So see you there in the other room, and have a good evening, or wherever you are, have a good day. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you, Ore and Emon. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.